Several days ago, on November 27th, Premier David Eby, BC Premier David Eby, held a press conference, and he was responding to the announcement in Calgary by Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith that the 1 million barrel per day pipeline from Alberta to the BC coast was being declared a project of national interest. And, there was a lot of cheering and enthusiasm in Calgary that day. David Eby, on the other hand, has opposed this project from the very beginning. He said it's a non-project, hasn't got a proponent, and so on. So we held a press conference to respond to it. And a lot of the questions were fairly standard, but there was one that really stuck out. Rob Shaw of Czech News asked the Premier, why aren't you more angry? Why aren't you angry at all? You have been in the past, why aren't you now? Watch the clip and you can see for yourself what Eby has to say about
You don't
that.
seem very angry. And I've noticed in the past, talking to you about pipelines, you've had kind of, good lines, kind of attacks at the federal government for doing this. It seems very muted today, your response. I'm wondering if you're changing the way you're talking about this to sort of be resigned to the fact that it's happening.
Well, I think about it this way, Rob, and you're right. I'm not angry today. I look at Danielle Smith and I see a premier of Alberta that she has a political imperative for her political party that she needs to meet. And am I going to be upset with Danielle Smith for advancing what the United Conservative Party wants her to do? Like, I understand that. The Prime Minister needs to de-escalate with Alberta and find a path forward. I understand that. The part where I'm going to get my elbows up, to borrow a phrase, is when this conversation about this non-existent project begins to actively compromise projects here in British Columbia that are real and meaningful and will actually make a difference in British Columbia for people who live here, for our government's finances, for federal government finances, and so on.
Now, I've been thinking about Shaw's question and Eby's response now for a couple of days. And this morning I remembered what had triggered my interest in that. And that is the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago made a speech when he announced the second tranche of these ponies, they're called, projects of national interest. And he was in Terrace, BC, gave a press conference, and here's what he had to say. By 2040, it's estimated the global LNG demand will rise by 60%, and Canada will be ready. We're home to the world's fourth largest reserves of natural gas, and we have the potential to supply up to 100 million tons annually of new LNG exports to Asia. But that will require major investment across a wide range of infrastructure. There's three things I want you to focus in on in that quote: 100 million tons annually, LNG exports to Asia, and need investments across a wide range of infrastructure. So I thought, well, okay, maybe I could try to estimate the cost of that wide range of infrastructure. So I'm going to walk you through my back of the cocktail napkin calculations, and here we go. So to get to 50 million tons per annum by 2030, and we'll just say MTPA, that's the abbreviation, and then 100 MTPA by 2035, here's where we go. Here are the capital assumptions for the plants, the LNG liquefaction plants. We know that LNG Canada, which makes 14 MTPA, costs $40 billion. So if we were to say that in order to get to the 2030 goals, we'd need two of those plants, that would be $80 billion. That gives us 28 MTPA and about altogether about 49 MTPA. So hitting the Prime Minister's target. To hit the 2035 target, you'd need three more LNG plants the size of LNG Canada, and that would get us up another 49 MTPA at $140 billion. So now we've got basically a total of $220 billion of capital expenditure to build the plants to hit 100 million tons annually. That was the Prime Minister's goal. But it doesn't stop there, because you've got to get the gas to the plants on the coast. And we had a Coastal GasLink pipeline was built at 3 times the original cost, but it came in at $14.5 billion. And the Prince Rupert gas transmission, which is is planned to supply a planned project by the Nishka, would come in around $12 billion. So if we said that to supply all of the gas that would be required by all of those new plants I just mentioned, it would be 5 pipelines at about, we'll say $12 billion a piece, and there's $60 billion. So now we're up to $280 billion of capex. But hang on a second. The whole point of the LNG expansion is to make it clean LNG. And to do that, you have to electrify the liquefaction process, because what liquefaction does is it takes natural gas and it compresses it, it chills it down to, I think it was like 160 minus 165 C, something like that. It's very, very cold. And it takes, and you either do it with gas, which you take out of your gas stream, or you do it with electricity. That's what, then there's no emissions to it, because BC has almost 100% hydro. And so for all of that liquefaction, the estimate is 30 to 40 terawatt hours per year. Now, just to give you some context here, the Site C dam, which just came on board, is 5.1 terawatt hours per year. So you need 7 to 8 more Site C dams. And the total cost of the electricity is not all that much, about a couple $1 billion. But they're not building any more dams. So we'd have to do this with wind and solar farms. And I calculated the cost of the wind farms to meet the requirement. And you'd have to have 40 to 45 of them, 250 megawatt wind farms. And that would cost about $22 billion to do that. And you could do with solar as well. And that would require 100 to 115 200 megawatt solar farms. So let's just go with an estimate of $22 billion. Now we're at $300 billion. And that it doesn't even include the increase in natural gas production up in Northeast BC, because that'll require a tremendous tremendous increase in production. So there'll be drilling, and then there'll be the wells that'll be completed, and there'll be pipelines to feed the big pipeline, and there'll be a lot of capital spent there. But I just didn't have the capacity. I don't know how to make those calculations. So let's just say, for sake of argument, $300 billion all in, compared to what? That pipeline that Danielle Smith talks about. Well, the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline cost the federal government $34 billion to build at 590,000 barrels per day. So if you did 1 million barrels a day and you said $50 billion, I mean, you're, within spitting distance, right? So Danielle Smith gets a $50 billion pipeline, and David Eby potentially gets $300 billion of LNG capital expansion. And then all of the jobs that come with operation, which would be a lot more than you get with an oil pipeline, and whatever the expansion is in the oil sands. Are we beginning to see why maybe David Eby wasn't all that angry? And you can bet, even though Eby was shut out of the conversation, that there were secret negotiations between Carney and Smith, and he was kind of miffed at that, and he should be. He should be embarrassed, right? It's like being, at the kids' table. The adults are talking over here. But I kind of suspect that there have been some conversations between the Prime Minister and the BC Premier where Carney said, keep your powder dry. We've got, LNG coming your way. And my goodness, if it's $300 billion or even anywhere close to that, compared to what Smith is going to get for a pipeline. And not only that, here's another thing. Have you noticed that every time they talk about this, they talk about Indigenous participation? Now, first of all, BC is committed to the UNDRIP principles and Aboriginal consent, and they've gone a long way. I'm sure it's not, as much as the Indigenous communities, the First Nations would like, but nevertheless, BC has made a huge effort to build relationships with the various First Nations, because BC is almost all unceded territory, right? In the other provinces, you have treaties, not in BC. So this is a big deal. And so you can see that bringing the Indigenous communities on and giving them ownership in a pipeline or even partial ownership, equity in a pipeline, goes a long way to generating a local Indigenous economy, which had been a big complaint for a long time, and generating cash flow. And the prime minister made a big deal out of the fact that Alberta will be bringing in loan guarantees from the Aboriginal, I think it's in the Indigenous Loan Corporation or the Aboriginal Loan Corporation, one of those. But anyway, there's a provincial agency that will backstop Indigenous loans in oil and gas projects. Well, the federal government has one of those, and I haven't checked, but I strongly suspect that the BC government has one as well. So if you're David Eby, now remember, the Prime Minister said that the BC government and BC First Nations have to be on board. So if you kind of, I won't say that David Eby was bribed or bought, but come on. I mean, these kind of big projects take coalitions. And in coalitions, it's always, if you want something, you got to give something. And so the Prime Minister wanted a pipeline, Alberta wanted a pipeline, and what did he give David Eby? Federal support for more LNG, and he's made it very clear how big that, what his goals are. And let's not forget, okay, because there's been a lot of, speculation about, Carney playing 4D chess and outsmarting Danielle Smith. My explanation makes a lot more sense. Now you know what BC is likely to get, and now you know how BC First Nations will come on board. And I'm not going to say they've been bought, but they see this is a pretty good opportunity for them. Why would they not jump at this, right? I mean, that makes perfect sense. They would want to become partners. Now, not all First Nations will be on board. Already the coastal First Nations are opposing the pipeline, and you can bet that there will be others along the route. But I imagine the Prime Minister has never thought for a moment that there would be 100% Indigenous support. That is just not going to happen. I can't tell you how many times I've heard Indigenous leaders say, look, we're the 600 plus of us across the country. We don't always agree on everything. And that's what's going to happen here. But the Prime Minister will say that, hey, we got, BC has come on board. We're doing this LNG deal, and we got the, very significant number of BC First Nations because they're getting equity in it. And there will be Alberta First Nations who also get equity. So they'll be on board. And that's the way this deal is going to play out. And so all the folks who are saying, that this pipeline will never be built, it's just a, pipeline to nowhere. I don't think so. Now, we here at Energy Media have made the case there's still no business case for a pipeline. There's not going to be enough customers in Asia to support it. And we've made the same argument about LNG. So that's our position, that there is no business case. But I can tell you from the conversations that I've had with people in Ottawa, Ottawa doesn't care. Now, this is kind of startling, and I'll bringing you some more information about this. We're kind of rooting around the underbelly of Ottawa to find sources inside the government and outside the government to talk about this. But what we've heard already is Ottawa is just obsessed with getting stuff built by expending. Why would we be surprised? We elected a banker as Prime Minister of the country. And he chose as his Minister of Energy another investment banker, Tim Hodgson. And Tim Hodgson, they both worked together at Goldman Sachs. Then when Carney became CEO of the Bank of Canada, he brought along Hodgson as his deputy. And what is Hodgson's reputation? He's a deal maker. He's a bulldog with deals. He gets deals done. Now the pieces, all the tumblers are clicking, aren't they? You can see how this arrangement, this deal, where Carney's going with this. This is well thought out. I mean, I can see how this won't be easy, and there'll be lots of, political tension between Alberta and BC, but I can see how this could get stick-handled, and all of this stuff could get built, even if there's no business case in Asia, because nobody's paying any attention to it. And you know what? then the one obvious objection to this is, why isn't the private sector interested? Well, the private sector thinks this is pretty risky. I'll grant you that. But what happens if the public sector takes a lead role or even plays a supporting role and puts in public money to de-risk those projects? So the pipeline, Alberta comes up with a private corporation, kicks in 10, 20, 30 billion dollars, takes it from pensions that they control, Albertans' pensions, and boom. Then the private sector says, oh, well, if you're going to put in $30 billion, then we'll come in too as junior partners and we'll run it for you and make sure it gets built. You can see the beginning of the deal coming together. So don't be so quick to dismiss this and say that it'll never going to happen and Mark Carney knows what he's doing. No, no, no. Mark Carney is being a banker here, folks. He's putting the deals together. And he's got his right-hand man that once all the pieces are aligned, the right-hand man, Hodgson, is going to come in and make that thing work. Mark my words, that's what's going to happen.